There's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try look I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? For you I'd give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, are you the one when I try look I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? You can see straight through my life. Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try look I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? For you I'd give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? You can see straight through my light. Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh,
Okay, good evening. Where are we at? Here we go. Okay, so we're up to chapter 8 of, I don't know how many chapters, 295 pages. We're on page 63 for Revan. So we'll read 8 and 9 tonight. That's the plan, anyway. Depends on how long they are. Usually 2's not too bad in this book so far. If I can get the frog out of my throat. All right. Just jump straight on into it, shall we? Bastarda's orange sun was setting quickly. Scourge crouched in the shadows of a cramped alley in the warehouse district on the outskirts of Jirunga, excuse me, the planetary capital, watched it disappear. As darkness fell, the photosensitive street lamps kicked in, casting the entire district in a pale yellow glow. The dim artificial illumination was enough to give Scourge a clear view of the two-story building across the street. From the outside, there was no way to tell that the structure was the Separatists' base. There were no autoguns on the roof, no guards patrolled the perimeter. The loading bay doors were ordinary Durasteel, rather than the reinforced kind used to construct blast doors. The windows were blacked out, and several security cams panned back and forth, surveying the street, but neither was unusual for buildings in this district. Instead of military fortifications that might draw unwanted attention, the Separatists relied on anonymity and secrecy to protect them. They would be unprepared for the wrath about to rain down upon them. His comlink beeped softly, followed by Murtagh's whispered voice, "Team is in position." "Hold until my signal," Scourge replied. "Give me time to take out those cams." "Could be droids in there," Cecil chimed in. "You sure you don't want Murtagh's team to go in first and clear the way?" Scourge gritted his teeth, but did Cecil know about Scourge's difficulties in taking down the droids at the UDM plant? Were his words a way of saying, "I know your secrets, I know your weaknesses"? On the other hand, if Cecil was just making a joke based on what had happened on their last mission, then Scourge's paranoid overanalysis meant that the slimy little sycophant had gotten to him. Neither option sat well with the Sith Lord, particularly since he still wasn't sure whether Cecil was trying to get him killed. "Remember the plan," Scourge snapped. "The two of you stay back until I give the all clear. We can't risk a stray blaster bolt taking out our Lord's favorite advisor. Leave the dirty work to me and your team." "Understood," Murtagh agreed. Keeping Murtagh out of the battle wasn't the best tactical choice, but it was worth it to keep Cecil away from the action. Scourge didn't need to be looking over his shoulder while he was fighting the Separatists. Plus, Murtagh would be at a safe distance as well, just in case he turned out to be a co-conspirator. I'll send the signal once I poke out their eyes, Scourge said, rising to his feet. Careful to stay in the shadows, Scourge crossed the street to the building adjacent to the base and crept around the back. There he located the utility ladder running up the side of the building and climbed to the rooftop, from which he could look down on the roof of the Separatist base. The gap between the buildings was substantial, nearly 10 meters. Scourge measured the distance, took a dozen steps back, then ran to the edge and leapt over the precipice. He pulled his knees up and tucked into a forward roll as he landed, then sprang to his feet, lightsaber drawn and ready. There were 4 cams on the roof, mounted on poles at each corner. In rapid succession he reached out with the force and snapped them off one by one, sending them tumbling from their perches to shatter on the street below. "Target is blind. Move in," he said into his comlink. In the street below, small squads of Murtaugh's soldiers were approaching the building. Scourge waited while they launched their first volley of flash and stun grenades, followed by a round of suppressing fire as the soldiers took cover positions near the door. From inside came the sound of blaster carbines as the Separatists returned fire. Moving quickly but calmly, Scourge crossed the rooftop to the hatch built into the center. A few seconds later, it swung open and a pair of Separatists emerged, snipers coming to the roof to take a position on the attackers below. Scourge hacked down the first with his lightsaber, then grabbed the second by the scruff of his collar and yanked him off his feet. The young human looked at him with abject horror, his panic so great that he never even thought to raise his weapon. The Sith Lord fed on the man's fear, savoring it as the heat of the dark side rushed through him. Effortlessly toting the sniper along, he took 3 quick steps toward the rooftop's edge, then hurled the man over. The sniper's terrified scream was cut short a second later by his fatal impact with the ground below. Scourge turned and raced back to the open hatch. He could hear frenzied shouts and blaster fire. An instant later, an explosion rocked the entire building, followed by several seconds of silence. Another round of blaster fire and shouting confirmed that Murtaugh's team had breached the entrance. Scourge leapt through the hatch leading into the warehouse's upper floor. There were no interior walls. It consisted of a single massive room. In the far corner, a staircase led down to the lower level. A row of mattresses ran along one wall, but the primary purpose of the space seemed to be storage. Crates and footlockers were scattered about, along with a haphazard collection of armor, weapons, and other military equipment. A computer terminal had been set up near the mattresses, along with 4 blank monitors that would once have shown the images from the security cams on the roof. Scourge registered all of this without conscious thought. His primary focus was on the 20-odd humans struggling into combat gear to join the battle downstairs. Unfortunately for them, that was never going to happen. Like a red wind, Scourge swept through their ranks, slashing left and right, hewing off limbs and decapitating bodies. Violent bursts of the Force picked his victims up and tossed them around like rag dolls, breaking bones and shattering skulls. The Separatists offered virtually no resistance. They had been caught off guard. They hadn't expected an ambush from the roof. These were not soldiers. They were ordinary men and women who had received only the most basic training when they joined the cause. Scourge's savage and sudden assault, and the bloody carnage he left in his wake, sent them into a panic. He fed on their primal fears. Some he killed, others he left mortally wounded and writhing on the floor, their lives enduring for 30 or 40 agonizing seconds, while their high-pitched cries of pain fueled his bloodlust. Had the Separatists coordinated their efforts into a focused and organized counterattack, they might have been able to challenge him, but they just scattered, running for their lives. Scourge drank in their terror and confusion, and felt the growing power of the dark side. He channeled that power and refocused it, sending it out in waves that rippled across the room, further inciting the panicked retreat of his enemies. When 2 women managed to resist the onslaught of fear and fight back, he was on them in an instant, cutting them down with a few quick slashes of his lightsaber. Everyone else was running. Some fled downstairs. Scourge let them go. They wouldn't get past Murtaugh's team. Others tried to hide, cowering behind crates and footlockers, but Scourge didn't need to see them to hunt them down. He could sense them through the Force. Trembling and sobbing silently, their minds numb with shock, and he stalked them one by one, breathing hard, not with exertion, but excitement. It was over in minutes. Only then, standing alone amid the bodies, did Scourge notice that the sound of battle from below had ended. Moving quickly, he crossed the room and descended the staircase. The floor below was similar to the one above, except for a row of offices built along the east side of the building. There were no interior walls. The floor was stacked with crates and piled with supplies. Bodies were scattered everywhere. Most were separatists, but Scourge noticed 3 or 4 wearing Nyrus's colors. The rest of Murtagh's team were methodically searching the dead, looking for survivors to interrogate. Scourge shook his head, knowing it was a waste of time. The greatest fear of any separatist organization was betrayal from within. Only the 2 or 3 top people would know anything useful, and they would never have allowed themselves to be taken alive. Confident that the building was secure, he deactivated his lightsaber and clipped it onto his belt. Then he activated the comm link on his wrist. "All clear, Murtagh. Get Seshel in here." "We're already inside," Murtagh's voice came back to him. "Found their control center in some offices at the back." Scourge had to clench his teeth to keep from screaming with rage. He had given specific orders, and Murtagh and Seshel had willfully disobeyed them. He made his way toward the offices with long, purposeful strides. As he approached, his anger gave way to suspicion. There had to be a reason they had defied him. Were they simply undercutting his authority, or was it something more sinister? Were they setting some kind of trap? As he drew near the offices, he saw Seshel and Murtagh huddled at a comm terminal. Surprisingly, there were no other members of Murtagh's team nearby. Scourge approached cautiously, probing with the Force to see if he could detect any immediate threat. Neither turned as he approached. Their attention was focused entirely on the comm. "Are there any others?" Murtagh was asking. "Not that I can find," Seshel replied, "but I might be able to—" "I gave you to an order," Scourge barked as he came up behind them. They both turned to face him. Murtagh's lips were pressed tightly together, and he seemed to have gone pale, but Seshel seemed more amused than scared. "After you were gone, I realized a flaw in your plan," he said, with an ingratiating smile. "If the Separatists had anything incriminating in here in the base, they'd probably try to destroy it before we could get our hands on it. I told Murtagh I might be able to salvage something if he could get me inside, but the longer we waited, the less chance we'd have to recover anything useful." Scourge didn't say anything, his eyes fixed on Seshel with a piercing glare. "We would have tried to contact you, but you'd already started the mission. We didn't want to distract you." "Do you take me for a fool?" Scourge asked softly, his hand casually falling to the hilt of his lightsaber. Seshel's smile faded, and Scourge caught a hint of fear in his eyes. "I don't normally disobey orders," Murtagh said, jumping in to try to defuse the situation. But in this case, Seshel was right. Once the Separatists knew the battle was lost, they ran a cleaner program on their computers to erase all their data files. If we'd waited for your signal, everything would have been lost. Scourge let the hand drop from his weapon. Now was not the time to settle this, but it was one more thing Seshel would answer for once he finally got a chance to speak with him alone. "What did you find?" "A recording of a recent communication," Seshel answered, pressing a button on the terminal. A ghostly blue, three-dimensional image crackled into being, hovered a few centimeters above the holocom. The frozen image was slightly under a meter in height, a perfect miniature of the speaker. "Darth Zedrix," Scourge gasped. "Most of the call was already erased by the cleaner program," Seshel explained, "but I was able to save this." He hit another button, and the recording began to play. It was obviously damaged. The image flickered in and out of focus, and the audio was plagued by bursts of static that cut off much of what was said. "Latest failed attempt," Zedrix said, his voice thin and crackling. "Nyrus is dangerous and must not be... Keep allegiances hidden. Stop the Emperor. Madness must end." "Can you get anything more?" Scourge asked. "Not here." Seshel answered. "Give me enough time and the proper equipment, and I should be able to come up with plenty." "Tell your team to load up every terminal and data file they find," Scourge instructed Murtaugh. "Nyrus won't be pleased if we leave something important behind." Seshel didn't say anything, but the grin on his face spoke volumes. Nyrus's personal slave greeted them at the front door as the three arrived back at the palace. "My mistress received your message," she said to Scourge. "She wishes to speak to you at once." "Get started on those data files as soon as Murtaugh's team finishes unloading them," he said to Seshel. "Forgive me, my lord," the young Twi'lek said, her voice trembling slightly. "Darth Nyrus wants to speak to all three of you." Scourge glanced from the slave to Seshel and Murtaugh, wondering if they knew anything more than he did. They only shrugged. "Let's go," Scourge said with a brisk nod. The Twi'lek turned and led them down the now familiar corridors to Darth Nyrus's personal chamber. As she always did, the slave knocked once on the door and waited for an acknowledgement from within. "Enter," Nyrus called. The slave opened the door and slipped to the side to allow Scourge, Murtaugh, and Seshel to crowd into the small room where Nyrus sat at her computer terminal, looking as if she hadn't moved since the last time Scourge had seen her there. She flicked off the terminal, spun in her chair, and stood up. "Is it true?" she asked, not even bothering to greet them. "Is Darth Zedrix a traitor to the Empire?" "We found a recording of a call from him at the Separatist base," Seshel said. "They were obviously working with him." Despite the compelling evidence, Scourge wasn't fully convinced. Zedrix was human, which didn't sit well with some of the Sith pureblood families in the nobility of the Empire. Yet, whatever petty prejudices he had endured in his life were insignificant compared with all he had achieved. Darth Zedrix was the longest-serving member of the Dark Council, having joined a full decade before Nyrus. He had risen to the penultimate position in the Empire, and while Scourge could understand his desire to eliminate Nyrus or other potential rivals, it was hard to imagine that he would be bold enough to challenge the immortal, all-powerful Emperor. "Zedrix's betrayal makes no sense," he said, feeling confident enough in his analysis of the situation to voice his opinion. "It makes perfect sense if you know the man as I do," Nyrus assured him. "Zedrix is old and desperate. He knows his position has become vulnerable. Soon the Emperor will have no further use for him. In his arrogance, he thinks he can usurp the Emperor's position and save himself. That is why he plotted with the Separatists to assassinate me. He knows those of us currently on the Dark Council would oppose him in his bid for power. He seeks to replace us with new members who are weak and inexperienced. He thinks he will be able to manipulate them and seize control of the entire council, so that they will follow him when he finally moves against the Emperor." Excuse me. Her explanation made sense. He had seen firsthand how those in power became desperate when they sensed their positions were threatened. "It won't be long before Darth Zedrix learns of the attack on Bastirda," Nyrus continued. "We must act quickly." "I'm surprised the Emperor instructed you to deal with this," Scourge remarked. "I'd have expected him to order the Imperial Guard to arrest Zedrix." "The Emperor doesn't know," Nyrus said. "Darth Zedrix has allied himself with Separatists," Scourge insisted. "He's a traitor to the Empire. It is our duty to report him." "I don't think that would be the best plan," Seshel continued, ignoring Scourge and addressing Nyrus directly. "We have little evidence, and your rivalry with Zedrix is well known. If we come forward with these accusations, he will simply deny them. The Emperor is unlikely to act without first gathering more proof. This will give Zedrix a chance to cover up his involvement or go into hiding." "Seshel is right," Nyrus said. "The element of surprise is our greatest advantage. Zedrix doesn't know we have exposed his treachery. If we strike now, we can catch him unprepared." It was obvious her mind was made up, and Scourge could follow the logic of her arguments. Yet he still felt uncomfortable not reporting Zedrix to the Emperor. An assault on his stronghold will be difficult, Murtaugh warned. We don't have the numbers to overwhelm his defenses, and I don't like hiring mercenaries for a job like this. Too much chance one of them will sell us out to Zedrix. Perhaps assassination is the way to go, Sechel suggested. Do to him what he tried to do to you. We would need a particularly skilled and accomplished assassin, Nyrus said. She looked at Scourge. Do you think you can get close enough to Zedrix? Scourge carefully considered all the variables before he replied. His first instinct was to propose an undercover operation, with him seeking a position on Zedrix's personal staff. Over several weeks he could study the routines of his intended victim and all his servants, patiently waiting for a chance to catch him alone, unarmed and unprepared. But there were no Sith among Zedrix's followers. Many Sith were prejudiced against humans. No doubt the Dark Counselor would never allow Sith too close to him, fearing they might one day turn on him. Scourge might be able to find some other way to infiltrate Zedrix's inner circle, but as Nyrus had pointed out, they needed to act quickly. There wasn't time for a prolonged undercover mission. Inside his stronghold, he is untouchable, he declared, finally. There may be a way to lure him out, Sechel said. The Separatists seem to use coded communications whenever they contact Zedrix. If I can replicate the code, I can send a message requesting an urgent meeting at some remote location. An ambush might work, Murtaugh agreed. Zedrix won't want to draw attention to his treachery. At most, he'll have 2 or 3 of his most trusted followers with him. With enough troops, we should be able to take him down. No, Nyrus said, shaking her wizened head. Zedrix would sense it coming. Whoever we send will have to hide his presence through the Force until Zedrix walks into the trap. It was obvious whom she was referring to, but Scourge was still reluctant. Asking me to kill a member of the Dark Council is not as simple as you make it sound. I did not expect you to balk at this task, Nyrus said. He has committed treason. He brought this on himself. You misunderstand, Scourge said, choosing his words carefully. The human traitor deserves to die, but he is a Dark Lord of the Sith. Alone, what chance will I have against him? I should have known, Sechel said, grinning. You're afraid. Fighting a battle I can't win isn't brave, Scourge shot back. It's stupid. At least you have the courage to speak your mind, Nyrus said. You already have enough sycophants, Scourge replied, glaring at Sechel. Nyrus flashed one of her ghastly grins, sending a chill down Scourge's spine. Somehow he kept himself from shuddering. I think the 2 of us should continue this conversation privately, she said. Sechel and Murtaugh bowed and left without a word. Scourge was pleased to see they were chastened by their sudden exclusion. Nyrus didn't speak until the Twi'lek servant had closed the door behind them. You are right to be cautious, she said, but you underestimate your own abilities. Scourge's thoughts jumped back to the slaughter at the Separatist warehouse. He remembered the energy and exhilaration he'd felt. He could sense his power was growing. His connection to the dark side had never been stronger. But butchering poorly prepared soldiers was not the same as facing highly trained Sith. Zedrix won't come alone. He'll have me outnumbered. Zedrix surrounds himself with acolytes of the dark side. Your talent will let you feed on their power and turn it against them. The greater your opponent's connection to the Force, the stronger you become. Strong enough to kill a member of the Dark Council? Against me you would stand no chance, Nyrus replied, but Zedrix is old and infirm, and he is human. They are a lesser species. Over the decades, the dark side has exacted too great a toll on his body. He is a hollow shell of what he once was. He holds on to his current position only because of his cunning. His followers obey him without question, too frightened of his reputation to see how age has ravaged his flesh and left him weak. Nyrus paused, waiting for Scourge's response. He wasn't eager to offer one without carefully considering everything he had learned. He believed what Nyrus had told him about his own abilities. He had felt the truth of it in his most recent battles, but he wasn't ready to trust her. If Zedrix was really as weak as she claimed, she wouldn't need Scourge's help to eliminate him. The truth was, Scourge wanted to kill Zedrix. It wasn't just his loyalty to the Emperor, though he firmly believed the only fit punishment for treason was death. He wanted to test himself against a member of the Dark Council. He wanted to prove to himself and to Nyrus that he was worthy of this task. If Darth Zedrix fell to his hand, his name would be hailed and feared throughout the Empire. Nyrus would be indebted to him for eliminating her rival, and the Emperor would reward him for executing a traitor. It was unlikely he would be chosen to replace Zedrix on the Dark Council. Scourge was still too young, too unknown. He hadn't forged the necessary political alliances or built up a cadre of servants and followers. Yet this would be a bold first step. It would make his name known in the halls of power, and when another vacancy opened on the council down the road in 5 years or maybe 10, he would be the leading candidate. "Tell Cecil to set up the meeting," he said. Nyrus smiled again, but this time Scourge didn't find it so unnerving. Instead, he found himself wondering if it would be her he replaced when he finally ascended to his rightful position. And that is the end of that chapter. Chapter 9 should be roughly the same length. They all seem to be 6 or 8 pages. So let's jump into it. Chapter 9. Revan stared at the flickering topographic map of Rekiad on the Ebon Hawk's navigation screens. The glacier-covered world had never been settled. No cities or villages dotted his screen. The scans revealed nothing but a frozen wasteland of ice and snow, stretching off for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. According to Canderous, the Mandalorians had set up a temporary landing field somewhere on the planet's surface. The clans that had gathered on Rekiad worked together to maintain and protect the vessels there. It was effectively neutral ground. Outside the landing field, however, each clan laid claim to its own territory, a claim they were willing to fight to defend. Neither Revan nor Canderous thought it was wise to take the Ebon Hawk to the communal landing strip. Outsiders weren't welcome among the Mandalorians. Canderous figured they'd have better luck dealing directly with Clan Ordo, his own people. The original plan was to land within walking distance of Clan Ordo's base camp and approach on foot. Using spaceports was rarely a preferred option for the kind of smugglers and miscreants who had owned the Ebon Hawk throughout its history, and many had installed custom upgrades to allow the ship to land in less than ideal conditions. But Revan doubted they had ever intended to visit a world as inhospitable as Rekiad, and he was starting to have second thoughts. Gale force winds hammered the ship's hull, causing it to buck and lurch, and a blizzard of swirling snow and ice limited the range of the Hawk's sensors. To get close enough for the topographic scan, Revan had to bring them in only a few hundred meters above the surface of the world, close enough that one wrong move would send them crashing into the surface. T3 beeped anxiously at Revan's side, crowding the pilot's chair as Revan fought to keep the ship level. "Get Canderous up here," Revan barked. "Tell him to check those grid coordinates again." The little astromech droid spun around and sped off in search of the third member of their crew. A gust of wind caused the ship to veer down and to the left. The safety restraints bit into Revan's flesh as he jammed the throttle forward and yanked back on the stick, pulling the ship up out of a steep dive moments before it hit the ground. The ship veered off course, and suddenly a massive glacier jutting up from the planet's frozen surface materialized on the nav display. Revan banked hard to avoid plowing into the wall of ice, but even the lightning-fast reactions of a Jedi couldn't entirely overcome the Hawk's momentum. The ship was spared a direct hit, but its underside clipped a sharp outcropping of ice. The impact sent the Hawk into a spiraling, twisting roll. Revan wrenched the stick from side to side, fighting for control. Using the Force, he was able to anticipate and react to the erratic flight with instantaneous precision adjustments, keeping the ship aloft until it regained its equilibrium. The immediate crisis averted, Revan took the Hawk up to a safer altitude and set the autopilot. Then he slumped in his chair and let out a long, low sigh. After a few seconds, he straightened up, readjusted his restraining belts, and checked the instrument panel. A blinking red warning light, confirmed his fears. The impact with the glacier had damaged the landing gear. Revan muttered a curse under his breath, just as a much louder string of profanity came from Canderous, staggering into the cockpit. T3 rolled in after him, beeping indignantly. "You trying to smash us into gree pulp back there?" Canderous grumbled, plopping down into the co-pilot's seat. "I thought you knew how to fly this rusted slag heap." "I thought you said Clan Ordo had set up a camp somewhere on this frozen rock," Revan shot back. "Couldn't see a blasted thing on those grid coordinates you gave me." "Maybe they moved to another location," Canderous said with a shrug. "Can't have gone too far, though. Not in these conditions. Do a ground scan of the area and they'll probably turn up." "That's what I was doing," Revan replied through gritted teeth. "Turns out it's a good way to get up close and personal with a glacier." Canderous glanced over at the warning light. "That's why that red light's blinking?" "The landing gear got smashed up when we clipped the glacier." "You couldn't just fly around it?" Revan rolled his eyes. "Go down for another look," Canderous advised after a few moments of strained silence. "Clan Ordo's gotta be close by." "Even if we can find them, then what? You really expect me to bring the ship in on busted landing gear?" "You're a smart guy," Canderous answered, shifting to get comfortable in his seat. "You'll think of something." There wasn't much point in continuing the argument, so Revan let it drop. Yet he couldn't help but wonder at the recent change he'd noticed in Canderous. As long as he'd known the Mandalorian, he'd sensed an underlying tension in him. Like a soldier in enemy territory, he was always ready for a fight. As a Mandalorian, he was never fully accepted by those in the Republic, and he knew it. Now, however, he seemed different. He was still gruff and taciturn, but ever since they'd left Coruscant, he'd been less grim, more relaxed. He was eager to be back among his own people, and he wasn't about to let a few minor setbacks like a missing camp or damaged landing gear stop him. To be fair, Revan had no intention of abandoning their quest either. There was too much at stake to turn back, which meant Canderous was right. The only real option was to keep looking for Clan Ordo's camp and hope they got lucky. Revan brought the Hawk in low again, but this time he throttled it back to half speed. The swirling wind still made a rough ride, but at least he'd have more time to react if something went wrong. "See if you can do something to give our sensors a boost," he said to T3. The little astromech chirped with pleasure and extended a small probe from a panel in his side to interface directly with the Hawk's systems. While T3 worked, Revan began a standard search pattern with the original coordinates for the camp at the center. Taking the Hawk around in ever-widening circles, he spiraled outward, letting the sensors scan the ground for signs of life. Suddenly, T3 began beeping excitedly. Canderous leaned forward to look at the scanner's display. "I think your droid's got some rust on the brain," he said. "I don't see anything." Revan knew better than to doubt the little astromech. "Can you enhance the image?" he asked T3. T3 responded with a low whistle, and a second later a static-filled thermal image appeared on the screen. The details were difficult to make out, but it appeared to be a small collection of tents and temporary shelters built against the leeward side of a small mountain of ice and snow. "Could be them," Canderous admitted, reaching out one of his massive hands to give T3 a friendly pat on the head. The droid squawked an indignant protest, and he quickly pulled his hand back. "Doesn't look like there's a landing strip at the camp," Revan noted. "See any place for us to touch down?" The display zoomed out as T3 adjusted the Hawk's scanners to pan rapidly back and forth across the snow. A few seconds later, they zoomed in again. "Perfect," Revan said with a smile. "Nice work, T3." That's not a landing strip, Canderous cautioned. It's a giant snowdrift. With the landing gear shot, we're going to need something to cushion the blow when we hit the ground. You really think this'll work? Sure, Revan replied, but you'd better strap yourself in just in case. Canderous scrambled to lock in his safety belt as Revan sent the Hawk into its descent. T3 scooted across the cockpit to the metal braces anchored to the floor and locked his wheels in with a metallic thunk. Fighting wind and gravity, Revan struggled to keep the damaged ship level as he took it down. Seconds before they touched ground, a blast of wind grabbed the Ebon Hawk and pitched it hard to starboard. Revan jammed the stick to port, desperately trying to keep the ship from flipping over. It slammed into the snowbank at a 45-degree angle, carving a 50-meter-long trench in the powder before finally coming to rest. Looking through the small cockpit window, Revan could see nothing but blue-white flakes. The entire front half of the ship was buried in the drift, but the sensors indicated that, apart from the already damaged landing gear, the Hawk had survived relatively unscathed. More important, so had its passengers. Revan carefully unbuckled his safety belt, knowing he would have bruises where the straps had dug into him during the collision. Beside him, Canderous was doing the same. T3 simply unlocked his wheels from the braces and rolled free. I guess sometimes it's not so bad being a droid, Canderous groaned as he stood up, rubbing his right shoulder with his left hand. You mean like when you're marching through a blizzard? Revan asked. This snowdrift's at least 5 kilometers from the campsite. Canderous only grunted in reply. While the big Mandalorian gathered the gear and supplies for their trek from the cargo hold, Revan and T3 ran diagnostics on the Hawk to determine the full extent of the damage. Doesn't look too bad, Revan commented when they were done. Think you can fix it up while we head off to the camp? T3 beeped twice. It's going to be hard for you to keep up out there in the snow, Revan reminded him. Besides, someone has to stay and guard the ship. The astromech reluctantly whistled his consent. You get started on repairs. I'll go give Canderous a hand. It took them almost an hour before they were ready to venture out into the frigid wasteland. They were bundled up head to toe in thick winter garb, snow pants, hooded jackets, scarves, goggles, heavy boots, and fur-lined gloves, all of it white to provide camouflage in case they ran into trouble. Canderous had armed himself with a heavy repeating blaster carbine. He offered a similar weapon to Revan, but the Jedi shook his head. You don't want to be swinging that lightsaber around when we get to the camp, Canderous said. Jedi aren't too popular out here. Revan frowned, then nodded. He knew Canderous had a point, but he didn't relish the idea of lugging the massive gun along. He picked up a pair of blaster pistols. I'll get by with these, he said, sliding them into the straps on either hip. Suit yourself, Canderous said with a shrug. Then he added, when we get to the camp, let me do the talking. Remember, these are my people. I can live with that, Revan said, hitting the switch to lower the cargo hold's loading ramp. But if we're going to get there before dark, we'd better get moving. They maneuvered the hover sled they had loaded up with supplies down the ramp and out into the raging blizzard. The howling wind threatened to knock them off their feet and made conversation almost impossible. The swirling snow almost blinded them, but Revan had entered the camp's coordinates on a portable locator to keep them on track, and he used hand gestures to communicate their route to Canderous. The heavy layers of clothing made the sub-zero conditions bearable. The hard labor of trudging through the snow over uneven terrain helped warm them up, too. After almost 2 hours of slow progress, Revan saw the dim outline of a small mountain ahead of them. He signaled to Canderous, indicating that the camp was on the other side. The Mandalorian nodded and signaled back that they needed to step up the pace. Revan nodded his agreement. The light around them was fading as Rekiad's sun, invisible through the storm, slowly set. The last thing they needed was to have to press on in total darkness. As they skirted the base of the mountain and reached the leeward side, the wind died to almost nothing. It wasn't long before they could see the soft glow of lights from the camp. Gradually, more details of the camp came into view. There were roughly a dozen small tents, set up only a few meters away from a sheer wall of ice at the mountain's base. Set away from the tents was a roughly constructed shack. Revan noticed a pair of generators hooked up to it, no doubt to provide power and heat, and he guessed it doubled as a meeting room and a supply center for any stores that would suffer if left out in the cold. Several sleds were scattered among the tents, some laden with supplies, others empty. On the far side of the camp were 4 large, tarp-covered mounds. Revan's heart sank. As part of the terms of the surrender, he'd ordered the Mandalorians to disassemble their infamous basilisk war droids, great metal beasts the Mandalorians often rode into combat. Judging by the size of the covered objects and by whatever hints of shape weren't obscured by the tarps, some of the defeated had chosen to ignore his decree. "One more step and we paint the snow with your brains," a voice shouted out. 4 sentries rose up into view from behind the drifts, 2 on either side of Revan and Canderous. Dressed in heavy cold-weather clothes of mostly blues, golds, and browns, they were armed with blaster rifles, which they had carefully trained on the interlopers. "Lay your weapons down and identify yourselves." The speaker, a male, was the sentry closest to Revan on his left. Out of the corner of his eye, the Jedi could see that Canderous was holding his ground, careful to avoid any sudden movements, but not making any effort to obey the order. Revan decided the smart thing to do would be to follow his lead. "My name is Canderous of Clan Ordo," the big man shouted, "and I don't lay down my weapons for anyone." From the stunned silence, it was clear his name had gotten their attention. "How do we know you're really Canderous?" one of the other sentries demanded. This was also a man's voice, deeper than the first. "Well, Edric," Canderous replied, "I could punch you in the face until I straighten out that crooked beak of yours, but we'd probably all freeze to death before I finished." The sentry barked out a laugh, slung his gun over his shoulder, threw his arms wide, and ran to enclose Canderous in a fierce hug. "It's good to see you again, brother," he shouted. Revan was relieved to see that the other sentries had also lowered their weapons. They came forward to form a tight circle around Canderous as they clasped his hands, slapped him on the back, and offered loud traditional greetings in Mandoe. After a few minutes, the one Canderous had called Edric spoke up again. "Let's get you and your friend out of the cold," he said in Basic. "Leave your sled. We'll have someone else come get it." The other 3 sentries stayed at their post as Edric led Revan and Canderous through the camp toward the supply shack in the center. As they passed the tents, heads poked out to see what was happening. Shortly, a small crowd had grown in the newcomers' wake. Revan could hear a buzz of excitement building, but his Mandoa was too rusty, and he couldn't pick out what was being said. At the door of the building, Edric stamped his boots clear of snow before going inside. His guests did the same. The first thing Revan noticed was the warmth. His goggles fogged up, and he was only too happy to remove them to get a better view of the surroundings. As he had expected, the shack served as both supply hut and meeting room. There were 7 or 8 Mandalorians already inside the building, lounging among the crates and packages, using them as makeshift furniture. In one corner was a massive pile of coats, scarves, and gloves. Edric was already stripping off his cold-weather gear and tossing it on the pile. Revan quickly and gratefully followed suit. Canderous didn't have a chance to do the same. The instant he removed his goggles and unzipped his hood to expose his face, he was swarmed. Another round of traditional Mandoa greetings rose up from the well-wishers, and Revan couldn't help but notice the pure joy on his friend's face as he was reunited with the other members of his clan. One of the things Revan had always admired about the Mandalorians, even as he'd fought them, was their loyalty. The ties that held a clan together went beyond friendship and even family. It was an essential part of the culture, ingrained in children from the day they were born or adopted into the clan. Not wanting to detract from the moment, he stood a respectful distance away. He was just beginning to wonder how much longer the celebratory reception would continue when the door swung open and a tall, broad-shouldered figure forced its way into the room. The door slammed shut, and everything went silent. Nobody spoke as the figure peeled away the layers of clothing, revealing the face of an attractive woman. She had olive skin, and her straight, shoulder-length black hair was streaked with purple and red highlights. Her high, sharp cheekbones were tattooed with intricate blue swirls. Her eyes were also blue, but so pale they looked like shards of ice. Unlike anyone else that they had come across, she didn't rush over to greet Candace. Instead, she glared at him without saying a word. "Sukuigar, Candace," she finally said. It was a common Mandalorian greeting, but something about the way she said it made Revan think the literal translation of the words, "so you're still alive," was closer to her true intent. "Sukuigar, Vila," he replied softly. She took a step toward him, then snapped her head to the side to stare at Revan. She was tall enough to look him in the eye. Without looking back at Candace, she asked him in Mandoa, "Do you want me to speak basic so the outsider can understand us?" "I understand well enough," Revan replied in her native tongue. Vila arched her eyebrow in mild surprise, then turned her attention back to Candace. "What are you doing here?" "Is that any way to greet a clan brother?" Candace asked. "Are you still my clan brother? You left us after the war. You deserted Clan Ordo to become a mercenary." "There was no Clan Ordo after the war," Candace snapped back at her. "Tegris was dead. We had no leader. We were scattered, broken, defeated. I wasn't the only one who left." "We heard you were working for the Jedi," Vila said, her voice low and hateful. In the silence that followed, the sentry called Edric spoke up. "Sin Vetin," he said, and there was a general murmur of agreement from the others in the room. The literal translation of the phrase was "driven snow," appropriate given the conditions outside, but Revan knew that the true meaning of the phrase was closer to "the past is in the past." Mandalorians believed that once you took up arms and armor of the clan, your past was irrelevant. Edric was saying that whatever Candace had done over the past few years was irrelevant now that he had returned. From Vila's expression, it was difficult to tell if she agreed with him, but she let the matter of Candace's past drop. "I'm the leader of the clan now," she insisted. "I still have a right to know why you're here." "To help Clan Ordo find Mandalore's mask." Vila tilted her head to the side as if getting a different angle might help her see whether Candace was being completely honest with her. "And what about this outsider?" she asked, pointing to Revan. "He is my friend, my brother. He will help us in our search." "Do you have a name, outsider?" Vila asked. "His name is Avner," Candace said, cutting Revan off. "He's a mercenary. We met while I was working for Davik Kang." "You can't speak for yourself?" she asked, still focused on Revan. "I thought you understood Mandoa. Am I going too fast for you?" "I understand," Revan answered. "You speak well." There was a gasp from the crowd, followed by the sound of stifled, nervous laughter. Revan knew full well the insult he had given. The Mandalorians were warriors. They had nothing but contempt for diplomats and politicians. They valued actions over words, and he'd just implied that Vila was all talk. "Brother Candace vouched for you, so you can stay," Vila said through clenched teeth. "But if you betray us, I'll kill you. If your weakness causes any of my people to get hurt, I'll kill you. If you slow us down, I'll kill you. Is that clear? Wait, what was that second one again? Maybe I should write this down." There was another round of stifled laughter. Vila pretended not to hear it as she turned back to Candace. "Welcome home, brother," she said flatly. She grabbed her winter gear, quickly threw it back on, and left without saying another word. Once she was gone, the others in the room seemed to relax. Revan motioned to Candace, calling him over to join him in the corner before he was swallowed up in a crowd of old friends. "Avner?" he whispered in Basic. "That's the best name you could come up with. What's wrong with Avner? You just rearranged the letters in Revan. Relax, nobody out here is going to..." Candace stopped abruptly as he noticed Edric ambling toward them. Don't judge Vila too harshly, the sentry said, misinterpreting their hushed dialogue. She's a good leader, but she has a temper. She looked at Revan. You should remember that the next time you provoke her. I just got caught in the middle, Revan protested. Canderous is the one she's really mad at. I get the sense you two have a history. You could say that, the big man admitted. She's my wife. And that is the end of that chapter. So that takes us to chapter 10. Out of, how many chapters do we have? We have 29 chapters, so we'll start with chapter 10 next time. And yeah, that will be Monday. So I'm going to take a quick pause while I get ready to play some Greedfall. So I will end this session, and I'll see you all in just a little bit.
My heart is bleeding. I know the pieces. One is broken, one is bleeding. Because I have seen the fall. I have known about the body. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart. Don't say. If you leave it behind. Someone will break. I left you my heart. What did you do? You used to you left me soft. Was my love? Was it love? You have no answers. Don't know without you. How will I survive? You have no answers. Don't know without you. How will I survive?